My name is Blake Xander, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for 3 years. Most people in the neighborhood knew me as the quiet guy in the corner lot who kept to himself, worked from home doing software consulting, and occasionally drove his pickup truck out early in the mornings. What they didn't know was that my property was just the residential portion of a much larger estate. The 20-acre orchard behind the tree line had been in my family for 40 years, and when my father passed away 2 years ago, I inherited the whole operation. I bolted out my front door, not even bothering to grab shoes, and ran across my lawn. The morning dew soaked through my socks as I sprinted toward the property line where Brenda stood with her clipboard, looking as self-satisfied as ever. Her blonde, highlighted hair was pulled back in that signature tight ponytail that seemed to physically manifest her personality, and she wore her usual uniform of athleisure, where that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. "Stop! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, waving my arms at the crew who had already positioned their equipment near my oldest Honeycrisp tree. Brenda turned to me with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Blake. I'm glad you're here. We're finally taking care of this eyesore situation. These overgrown trees are blocking the sight line from the street and violating HOA Code Section 12.7 regarding property aesthetics and maintained landscaping. Those are my trees, Brenda. You can't just cut them down." She pulled out a document from her clipboard and waved it at me like it was a weapon. "Actually, according to the HOA bylaws that you signed when you purchased your property, any vegetation visible from the main roads must meet community standards. These trees are wild, unkempt, and several neighbors have complained about fallen apples attracting pests. The tree removal crew, a couple of guys in their 30s who looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, had paused their work and were looking between us uncertainly. Brenda, those trees are not subject to HOA regulations. They're part of my commercial orchard business, which is on separate property that extends beyond the subdivision boundaries." She laughed, actually laughed, in that condescending way that made my teeth grind. "Blake, everything within view of Meadowbrook Heights residents falls under our jurisdiction. I've done my research. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. Boys, continue please." I stepped between the crew and the trees. "I'm telling you right now, if you cut down a single branch, I will sue you, the HOA, and anyone involved for property damage and business losses. Those are mature commercial apple trees worth thousands of dollars each." One of the crew members, the older one with a gray beard, spoke up. "Look, man, we're just hired to do a job. We don't want any legal trouble." Brenda's face was turning red now, her composure cracking. "I have the authority from the HOA board. We had a vote. This is completely legal and within our rights." "Show me the survey maps you used," I said. "Show me proof that these trees are actually on HOA-regulated land." She sputtered for a moment, then regained her composure. "The survey is on file at the HOA office. I don't need to provide you with anything. You received a violation notice 3 weeks ago." I received a notice about needing to trim some hedges near my driveway, which I did. There was nothing about removing trees. The violation was updated at our last board meeting. You would know this if you ever attended. The crew leader was already packing up his equipment. "Lady, we're not cutting anything until this gets sorted out. We'll send you a bill for the service call." He and his partner started loading their chainsaw back into their truck. Brenda turned on them, her voice shrill. "You can't just leave. I paid a deposit. You'll get it back minus the service call fee. This is clearly a property dispute, and we don't get involved in those." As their truck pulled away, Brenda turned to me with pure venom in her eyes. "This isn't over, Blake. You think you can just ignore HOA regulations because you own some dirt outside our community. Your property is part of Meadowbrook Heights, and you will comply. My residential property is part of the HOA. Those trees are not. There's a very clear property line that your survey would show if you had bothered to look at it properly. She stormed off toward her white Mercedes SUV, and I stood there in my wet socks, adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I had a very bad feeling this was just the beginning. The rest of that day, I spent pulling together all my property documents. The original survey from when my grandfather first purchased the land in 1985. The subdivision agreement when the residential development was built in 2010, specifically carving out the orchard from HOA jurisdiction, and my business license for Xander Family Orchards. I made copies of everything and put together a comprehensive file. That evening, my property manager for the orchard, Rita Hernandez, called me after I had texted her about the incident. Rita was in her 50s, had been working with my father since she was in her 20s, and knew every single tree on that property like they were her own children. "Blake, are you serious? Brenda Cunningham tried to cut down the Honeycrisp row. Dead serious. I stopped them before they could start, but she's on a warpath now." Rita was quiet for a moment. "You know those trees are 50 years old, right? Your grandfather planted them himself, and they're our highest producers. We have contracts with 6 restaurants and 4 grocery stores, not to mention the farmer's market. If those trees come down, we're looking at probably $200,000 in lost revenue, minimum, not to mention the replacement costs and years it would take new trees to reach maturity." "I know. Trust me, I know." "Does she have any idea what she almost did?" "She doesn't care. She thinks because I live in the HOA subdivision, everything I own is subject to their rules." Rita sighed deeply. "This is exactly why your father avoided buying that house. He knew the HOA would be trouble eventually, but you wanted to be close to the orchard. And I like the house. I'm not letting some power-hungry HOA president bully me off my own property. What's your next move?" "I'm going to the next board meeting with all my documentation. I'll make them understand the legal reality, and hopefully, that will be the end of it." It was not the end of it. The HOA board meeting was held the following Tuesday evening in the community center, a nice building near the subdivision entrance that had been built with everyone's monthly dues. I arrived 15 minutes early with my folder of documents and found about 30 other residents already there, which was unusual. Normally, these meetings had maybe 10 people, mostly retirees with nothing better to do. Brenda sat at the front table with the other 4 board members, Keith Morrison, Janet Palmer, Doug Harvey, and Susan Chen. They were arranged like judges at a tribunal, and Brenda was clearly the ringleader. As soon as the meeting was called to order, Brenda wasted no time. "Before we get to regular business, we need to address a serious compliance issue. Blake Xander has been refusing to cooperate with a direct order from this board to remove hazardous trees from his property." I stood up. "That's a complete misrepresentation of what happened." "You'll have a chance to speak during the open forum portion," Brenda said dismissively. Janet Palmer, who was actually a reasonable person from the few times I had interacted with her, spoke up. "Brenda, if there's a dispute, maybe we should hear both sides now. The board has already voted on this matter." "I wasn't at that meeting," Janet said. "When did we vote?" "Emergency session last Thursday. You were notified via email." Janet pulled out her phone and scrolled through it. "I never received any email about an emergency session." Susan Chen nodded. "Neither did I." Brenda's face flushed. "Well, we had quorum with Keith and Doug. The vote was 3-0. A quorum requires 3 members present, but you need to notify all board members 24 hours in advance even for emergency sessions, Susan said. That's in the HOA governing documents. I was beginning to like Susan Chen a lot more than I had previously. She was an attorney, and apparently she actually read the rules everyone was supposed to follow. Keith Morrison, who owned a car dealership in town and was generally known as Brenda's yes man, jumped in. Look, the point is that Blake's trees are a problem. Multiple residents have complained. I'd like to see those complaints, I said. That's confidential, Brenda snapped. Actually, it's not, Susan said. Residents have a right to see any complaints filed about their property. That's state law regarding HOAs. This meeting was going completely off the rails, and I could see Brenda seething. Several residents in the audience were now murmuring among themselves, and I heard someone say they also hadn't received notice about an emergency session. I decided to take advantage of the chaos and spoke up loudly. I have documentation here that proves the trees in question are not on HOA-regulated property. They're part of my commercial orchard business, which is specifically excluded from this subdivision's jurisdiction per the original development agreement. That got everyone's attention. I walked up to the front table and started pulling out documents. This is the survey map from 1985 showing my family's original property. This is the subdivision development agreement from 2010 that created Meadowbrook Heights. If you look at Section 4, Paragraph C, it specifically states that the existing commercial orchard operation on the eastern portion of the Xander property is excluded from HOA jurisdiction and maintains its own separate legal status. I laid out the survey map that showed the clear boundary lines. My house sat on a 1-acre lot that was technically part of the subdivision. Behind my property line, clearly marked, was the 20-acre orchard with its own access road and entrance on the adjacent county road. Janet took the documents and studied them carefully, then passed them to Susan, who nodded as she read. Doug Harvey, who had been silent until now, leaned over to look as well. The trees you tried to remove are here, I pointed to the map, a full 50 feet behind the subdivision boundary line. They're on orchard property, not residential property. Brenda snatched the papers from Susan. This doesn't prove anything. The trees are visible from the subdivision, so they fall under our aesthetic guidelines. That's not how property law works, Susan said quietly. Brenda, if these documents are accurate and they appear to be official county records, then we have no jurisdiction over those trees. None. And if you had actually hired that tree removal service and they had cut down his trees, this HOA would be liable for massive damages. That's ridiculous, Brenda said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. I pressed my advantage. Those aren't just regular trees. They're part of Xander Family Orchards, which is a licensed commercial agricultural business. Those specific trees produce about 15,000 pounds of apples per year. They're mature, Honeycrisp trees, and each one is worth approximately $10,000 to replace, not counting the years of lost production while new trees reach maturity. The 5 trees you tried to remove represent about $200,000 in potential damages. The room went completely silent. Even Brenda seemed momentarily stunned by the numbers. Janet spoke first. Blake, I had no idea you ran the orchard. I thought you just worked from home. I do both. My father passed away 2 years ago and I inherited the operation. We supply several local businesses and have a regular booth at the Pineville Farmers Market. A woman in the audience, Margaret Torres, who I recognized from the neighborhood, spoke up. Wait, Xander Orchards. You're the one who grows those amazing Honeycrisps. I buy those every week at the farmer's market. Several other people started talking at once, and I heard multiple voices saying they also bought from my orchard stand. The tide in the room had completely shifted. Brenda tried to regain control. That's all very interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that fallen apples from those trees are attracting pests into our neighborhood. Then, I'll install better fencing along the property line, I said. I'm happy to work with any resident who has a legitimate concern. But you tried to destroy my livelihood without even checking if you had the legal right to do it. Doug Harvey cleared his throat. I think we need to table this issue and have our HOA attorney review these documents. Brenda, did you consult with legal counsel before authorizing the tree removal? The way Brenda's jaw tightened told me everything I needed to know. She had acted unilaterally, probably assuming I would just roll over and accept her authority. I'm the president of this board, and I don't need permission to enforce our community standards, she said. Actually, you do, Susan said. Any action that could result in legal liability for the HOA requires a vote from the full board after proper notice. And major enforcement actions like property removal definitely fall under that category. The meeting devolved further from there, with several residents demanding to know what other decisions Brenda had been making without proper board votes. Janet made a motion to schedule a special meeting with the HOA attorney present to review the situation, which passed 4-1, with only Brenda voting against it. As people filed out after the meeting, several neighbors came up to me to apologize and to say they had no idea about any of this. Margaret Torres even asked if I could bring extra apple cider to the farmers market that weekend because her book club wanted to do an apple tasting party. I left feeling cautiously optimistic that reason had prevailed. I should have known better. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound, a kind of mechanical grinding that seemed out of place. I looked out my bedroom window and felt my heart drop into my stomach. There was Brenda with a different tree removal crew, and they were already cutting into the first Honeycrisp tree. I didn't even get dressed. I ran outside in my pajama pants and t-shirt, shouting at the top of my lungs. Stop! Stop right now! But it was too late for that first tree. It was already listing dangerously to one side, the chainsaw having cut more than halfway through the trunk. As I reached the property line, the tree fell with a tremendous crash, its 50 years of growth ending in seconds. What have you done? I was shaking with rage, barely able to get the words out. Brenda stood there with her arms crossed, looking triumphant. I'm enforcing HOA regulations. You had your chance to comply voluntarily. The tree removal crew, a different company than before, was already moving toward the second tree. I recognized the logo on their truck. It was a company from 2 counties over. Stop, I yelled at the crew. That tree is not on HOA property. You're destroying private commercial property, the crew leader, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head, shrugged. We got a work order and payment up front, not our problem. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I'm telling you on video that you do not have permission to cut these trees. They are on private commercial property. I will be pressing charges for property destruction and suing for damages. The crew leader hesitated, then looked at Brenda. Lady, is this legit? Completely legit, she said. I have full authority from the HOA. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. I was practically screaming now. I showed the board last night the property surveys. These trees are on orchard property, not subdivision property. The second crew member, younger and clearly more nervous, said, maybe we should check this out. We're getting paid $5,000 for this job, the crew leader said. Let's finish it. I called 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. When the dispatcher answered, I explained that someone was destroying my commercial property without permission, and I needed police immediately. While I was on the phone, they cut down the second tree, then the third. I stood there feeling helpless and furious, documenting everything on video, getting clear shots of Brenda directing them, the crew's truck with the company name visible, and the destruction of each tree. By the time the Pineville police arrived, 4 trees were down and they were starting on the 5th. Officer Daniels and Officer Kim pulled up in their patrol car, and I had never been so relieved to see law enforcement in my life. "What's the situation here?" Officer Daniels asked, a tall black man in his 40s who looked like he had seen just about everything. "These people are cutting down trees on my commercial property without permission. I have documentation proving ownership and jurisdiction." Brenda immediately jumped in. "Officer, I'm Brenda Cunningham, president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. These trees violate our community standards, and I have the authority to have them removed." Officer Kim, a Korean-American woman who looked to be in her 30s, walked over to examine the fallen trees and the ones still standing. "Can I see the property surveys?" she asked me. I ran back to my house and grabbed my folder of documents, which I had thankfully left on the kitchen table. When I returned, both officers were talking to Brenda, who was insisting she had done nothing wrong. I spread out the survey maps on the hood of the police car and showed them the property lines. "This is the subdivision boundary. These trees are here, 50 feet outside that boundary on my orchard property. The orchard is a separate legal entity from the residential property and is explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction per the development agreement." Officer Daniels studied the documents carefully, then looked at the GPS coordinates on his phone. "These trees are definitely outside the subdivision boundary according to these surveys." "That doesn't matter," Brenda said. "They're visible from our community." "Madam, that's not how property rights work," Officer Kim said. "You can't destroy someone else's property just because you can see it." "I have the authority as HOA president, not over property that isn't part of the HOA," Officer Daniels said. He turned to the tree crew. "You need to stop work immediately. This is now a criminal investigation for property destruction." The crew leader looked panicked. "Wait, she said she had the authority. Did you verify that before you started cutting?" Officer Kim asked. "She paid us $5,000 up front." "That doesn't give you the right to destroy property without verifying ownership and permissions," Officer Daniels said. "Sir," he turned to me, "do you want to press charges?" "Absolutely, against her and the crew." Brenda's face went pale. "You can't press charges against me. I'm enforcing legitimate HOA rules." Officer Daniels walked over to examine the downed trees more closely, then turned back to us. "These are commercial apple trees, like part of a business." "Yes," I said. "Xander Family Orchards. I have a business license and everything." "Those trees produce thousands of pounds of apples per year. Each mature tree is worth about $10,000 to replace, not counting lost production." He whistled low. "So we're talking about what, 40,000 in property damage so far, at least. Plus lost production over the years it would take to replace them. We're looking at over 150,000 in damages." The crew leader looked like he was going to be sick. Oh man. Lady, you said this was legal." "It is legal," Brenda insisted, but her voice was shaking now. Officer Kim was taking notes. "Madam, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to make a statement." "The same goes for you," she said to the crew leader. "Are you arresting me?" Brenda asked, incredulous. "Not at this moment, but you're being investigated for felony property destruction." That's a serious charge in Oregon, especially when it involves commercial property. I watched as Brenda's entire demeanor changed. The confident, commanding presence evaporated, and she suddenly looked scared. "This is insane. I was just doing my job as HOA president. Your job doesn't include destroying property you have no jurisdiction over, Officer Daniels said. And based on these documents, you were informed just last night at a board meeting that these trees weren't under HOA control. We can prove that, I said. The meeting was last night. Multiple witnesses heard the board attorney being brought in to review the situation. She acted anyway. This made the situation so much worse for Brenda, and I could see the realization dawning on her face. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was deliberate destruction after being warned. More neighbors had come out now, drawn by the police cars and the sound of falling trees. Margaret Torres was there, along with Janet Palmer from the HOA board and about a dozen other residents. Several people had their phones out recording. Janet walked up, took one look at the situation and said, "Oh, Brenda, what did you do?" "I was enforcing community standards. We were supposed to meet with the attorney. You agreed to wait. I voted against that motion. That doesn't give you the right to act unilaterally." Janet turned to me. "Blake, I am so sorry. The board had no idea she was going to do this." Officer Kim was talking into her radio, requesting additional units and what sounded like a supervisor. Things were escalating quickly. The tree crew was now being questioned separately. I heard the crew leader telling Officer Daniels that Brenda had called them late last night, offering a premium price if they could come first thing in the morning before 7 a.m. She had specifically told them to come early before people started interfering. That was premeditation. That made everything worse. A sergeant arrived, a stern-looking woman named Rodriguez, who took one look at the scene and started asking pointed questions. After about 15 minutes of consultation with the other officers and reviewing my documents, she walked over to Brenda. "Mrs. Cunningham, I'm placing you under arrest for felony criminal mischief and malicious destruction of property. You have the right to remain silent." I watched as they handcuffed Brenda and put her in the back of a patrol car. Her face was a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Even as they drove her away, she was shouting about her rights as HOA president. The tree crew was also being detained, though Officer Daniels explained to me that their culpability was less clear since they had relied on Brenda's representations. Still, they would likely face charges unless they cooperated fully with the investigation. After the police left, taking statements and evidence photos, I stood looking at the 4 destroyed trees and the 5th one they had started cutting before being stopped. 50 years of growth, gone in less than an hour. These trees had been planted by my grandfather, tended by my father, and now destroyed by a petty tyrant who couldn't stand being told no. Rita arrived about 20 minutes later, having driven over as soon as I called her. When she saw the destruction, she actually cried. "Oh, Blake, those beautiful trees. Your grandfather would be heartbroken." "I know. What do we do now?" "Now I call our insurance company and a lawyer. Brenda's going to pay for every penny of this plus damages. And if the HOA is liable as well, which they probably are since she was acting in her capacity as president, then they're going to pay too." Rita nodded, wiping her eyes. "We need to assess the full damage. Those 4 trees produced about 12,000 pounds of apples last year. That's a lot of revenue lost." We spent the next few hours documenting everything, taking our own photographs and measurements. I called my insurance agent, who was horrified by the situation and immediately opened a claim. Then I called David Marks, the attorney who had handled my father's estate and knew the orchard business well. David listened to the whole story, occasionally asking questions, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Blake, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of property destruction I've ever heard. You have documentation proving ownership, documentation proving you warned them off, witness testimony from a board meeting the night before, and she still went ahead and did it anyway. This is going to be expensive for her. I want to make sure she can't do this to anyone else ever again. Oh, she won't be HOA president much longer, I can promise you that. Between the criminal charges and the civil liability she's done. The question is whether we go after her personally or the HOA as an entity. What's the difference? If we sue the HOA, it comes out of the community's reserve funds, which affects all your neighbors. If we sue her personally, it's her assets on the line. Given that the board specifically told her to wait for legal review, and she acted against that instruction, I think we have a strong case that she was acting outside her authority. That means personal liability. I don't want to hurt my neighbors. They didn't do anything wrong. Then we'll focus on Brenda personally. But be prepared, she's probably not going to have anywhere near enough assets to cover the full damages. We're looking at replacement costs, lost production, legal fees, and potentially punitive damages. This could easily be $500,000. I felt a headache coming on. I just wanted to live in a nice house near my orchard. I know, but you're in the right here completely. We're going to make sure you're compensated for this. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The story made the local news, which picked up on the angle of HOA president arrested for cutting down orchard trees. It turned out to be a bigger story than I expected because the Pineville Farmers Market was pretty popular, and a lot of people in the community bought from Xander orchards without realizing they knew me. The farmers market manager, Tom Chen, called me personally. "Blake, I saw the news. This is terrible. Those were your best producing trees, right?" "Yeah, 4 of my mature Honeycrisps, and they started on a 5th before the police stopped them." "How is this going to affect your supply? We have a lot of customers who specifically come for your apples." "I can maintain supply this season from the other trees, but next year we're going to be down about 12,000 pounds. I'll need to source from somewhere else or reduce what I can offer." Tom sighed. "This is such a mess. If you need anything, testimonials for court about the value of your business or whatever, just let me know." "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it." The criminal case against Brenda moved faster than I expected. Oregon takes property crimes seriously, especially when they involve commercial operations. Her attorney tried to argue that she had genuinely believed she had the authority as HOA president. But the fact that she had been explicitly told to wait for legal review the night before undermined that defense completely. The tree removal crew ended up testifying against her in exchange for reduced charges. They explained how she had specifically told them to come early in the morning, how she had paid them a premium rate in cash upfront, and how she had assured them multiple times that she had full legal authority. The prosecution used this to establish that she knew what she was doing was questionable at best. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the HOA board fallout. Janet Palmer called me about a week after the incident. "Blake, the board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Brenda as president. She's also being removed from the board entirely. We're bringing in a new attorney to review all of her actions over the past year to see if there are other problems. That seems wise. I'm so sorry this happened. The rest of us had no idea she would do something like this. We thought after the meeting everything was going to go through proper channels." "I appreciate that, Janet. For what it's worth, I don't blame the board or the HOA itself. This was all Brenda." "Well, our attorney says we still might have some liability since she was acting as president, even if she was acting improperly. But we're going to cooperate fully with your lawsuit. We want to make this right." That was actually a relief. The last thing I wanted was a protracted legal battle with my own neighborhood. The civil lawsuit moved forward in parallel with the criminal case. David filed a complaint against Brenda personally for property destruction, trespass, interference with business operations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were seeking actual damages of $220,000, plus punitive damages, plus attorney fees and costs. Brenda's attorney tried to get the case dismissed, arguing that she had been acting in good faith as HOA president. The judge wasn't buying it. At the hearing on the motion to dismiss, Judge Patricia Walsh looked at the timeline of events and said, "Counsel, your client was explicitly told at a board meeting to wait for legal review." She then hired a tree removal service that same night and had them come first thing the next morning before 7 a.m. That's not good faith. That's deliberately trying to accomplish something before anyone could stop her. Motion denied. The criminal case resolved first. Brenda ended up pleading guilty to felony criminal mischief, in exchange for the prosecution recommending probation instead of jail time. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to pay restitution of $50,000, which was the immediate replacement cost of the trees, and given 200 hours of community service. At the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood before the court and explained what those trees meant to my family, how my grandfather had planted them, how my father had cared for them, and how they were part of the business that supported not just me but Rita and 2 other part-time employees. I described the farmers market customers who depended on our apples, the restaurants we supplied, and how this one act of arrogance had caused ripple effects throughout the community. Brenda never apologized. Even when given the chance to address the court before sentencing, she talked about how stressful being HOA president was and how she was just trying to maintain property values. The judge was not impressed. The civil case took longer. David filed extensive documentation of damages, including expert testimony from an agricultural economist about the value of mature apple trees and the lost production over the time it would take for replacement trees to reach maturity. We also had testimony from Tom Chen about the impact on the farmers market, from my restaurant customers about how they had to find alternative suppliers, and from Rita about the emotional toll of seeing decades of work destroyed. Brenda's attorney made a settlement offer of $100,000, which David immediately rejected. We were in this for the full amount plus punitive damages. We wanted to send a message that you can't just destroy people's property because you have a little bit of authority. The case went to trial 8 months after the incident. It was a bench trial, meaning just a judge without a jury, which David said was better for us given the complexity of the property law issues involved. The trial lasted 3 days. We presented all our evidence, including the survey maps, the development agreement, the business records showing the value of the lost production, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that the damages were inflated, and that replacement trees didn't actually cost as much as we claimed. David destroyed that argument by bringing in the owner of a commercial nursery, who explained that replacing a 50-year-old Honeycrisp tree with a mature tree of similar size and production capacity would cost at least $15,000 per tree, not counting installation and the specialized care needed to ensure successful transplantation. Since Brenda had destroyed 4 complete trees and severely damaged a 5th, we were looking at $75,000 in replacement costs alone. Then, there was the lost production. David presented a detailed analysis showing that even with replacement trees, the orchard would lose approximately 12,000 pounds of apples per year for at least 3 years, until the new trees were fully established and productive. At the wholesale price I received, that was $48,000 in lost revenue. For retail sales that I did at the farmer's market, where prices were higher, the loss was even greater, another $36,000 over 3 years. The judge asked tough questions, but our evidence was solid. The property surveys clearly showed Brenda had no jurisdiction. The board meeting minutes showed she had been told to wait for legal review. The testimony from the tree removal crew showed she had deliberately acted quickly to prevent interference. Judge Walsh took a week to issue her ruling. When the decision came down, it was comprehensive and scathing. She found that Brenda had acted with willful disregard for clearly established property rights and had deliberately circumvented appropriate oversight procedures. The judge awarded us the full $220,000 in actual damages, plus another $150,000 in punitive damages, specifically intended to deter similar conduct in the future, plus attorney fees and costs of about $60,000. The total judgment was $430,000. Brenda's attorney immediately filed a notice of appeal, but David wasn't worried. The findings are so clear, and the judge's ruling is so well-reasoned, that I don't see an appellate court overturning this. She might get the punitive damages reduced, but the actual damages are going to stand. The problem, as David had predicted, was collection. Brenda and her husband owned their home, which was worth about $600,000 with maybe $300,000 in equity. But it was their primary residence which gave them some protection under Oregon law. They had other assets, retirement accounts and such, but a lot of those were also protected. David filed liens against their property and began the process of garnishing wages. Brenda's husband, Martin, who had been notably absent through the entire ordeal, finally reached out to David to discuss a settlement. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative and apparently was furious with his wife for what she had done. We ended up settling for $300,000 paid out over 5 years, with their house as collateral. It wasn't the full amount, but David advised that it was probably the best we were going to get without forcing them into bankruptcy, which would drag things out even longer. I accepted the settlement. I was never trying to destroy Brenda's life. I just wanted to be compensated for what she had destroyed of mine. The money from the settlement allowed me to purchase and install 5 mature apple trees, which cost even more than the nursery owner had estimated because they had to be carefully transported from an orchard in Washington that was selling off part of their inventory. Rita supervised the installation personally, making sure the trees were positioned correctly and had the best chance of successful establishment. The new trees survived, though they struggled that first year and produced only a fraction of what the mature trees would have. It would be another 2 years before they reached full production capacity, just as we had predicted. The HOA, meanwhile, underwent significant changes. Janet Palmer became the new president and immediately instituted reforms. They brought in a new management company, rewrote several of the more vague regulations to be clearer and more reasonable, and instituted a policy requiring board votes and legal review for any enforcement action above a simple warning letter. Several of my neighbors came by personally to apologize, even though they had nothing to do with what happened. Margaret Torres brought me a homemade apple pie, which was ironic, and we ended up becoming friends. She told me that a lot of residents had been unhappy with Brenda's leadership, but were afraid to speak up because she had a reputation for retaliating against anyone who opposed her. The farmers' market thrived despite the temporary reduction in my apple supply. Tom Chen actually used the story as a marketing point, not in an exploitative way, but as an example of why supporting local family farms mattered. We had a banner season that fall, and I had to hire an additional part-time employee just to handle the increased customer traffic. About a year after the incident, I was working in the orchard when I saw a car pull up to the entrance. It was Brenda. My first instinct was to call the police because she was still on probation and probably wasn't supposed to be contacting me, but something made me wait. She got out of her car and just stood there by the gate, not coming onto the property. I walked over, keeping the fence between us. "What do you want, Brenda?" She looked different. Older, tired, less polished. The tight ponytail was gone, replaced by a simple style. She wasn't wearing expensive athleisure, but just jeans and a plain shirt. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I know it's too late and probably meaningless, but I needed to say it. What I did was wrong." I was so caught up in being HOA president and maintaining control that I stopped thinking about whether I was actually doing the right thing. I didn't say anything, just waited. "I lost everything," she continued. "My position, my reputation, most of my friends. My husband barely speaks to me. We're probably going to lose our house because we can't keep up with the settlement payments and the mortgage. I had to take a job as an administrative assistant, making a quarter of what Martin makes, because no one will hire me for anything better." Part of me wanted to feel sympathy, but then I thought about my grandfather's trees lying on the ground, cut down for no reason other than her pride. "I destroyed your family legacy because I couldn't admit I was wrong," she said. "And I'm sorry. That's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry." She got back in her car and drove away before I could respond, which was probably for the best because I'm not sure what I would have said. That night, I called Rita and told her about the encounter. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Your father used to say that forgiveness was about freeing yourself, not the other person. He said holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I don't know if I can forgive her. You don't have to. Not yet, maybe not ever. But you also don't have to let what she did define the rest of your life. You've rebuilt. The orchard is doing well. You're doing well." She was right, of course. The orchard was thriving. I had expanded operations, adding 3 more acres of Gala apples to diversify the crop. The farmer's market booth was consistently one of the highest-grossing vendors. I had hired 2 more part-time employees, including a young woman named Emma who was studying horticulture and was brilliant with the trees. The HOA had become what it should have been all along, a reasonable organization that maintained common areas and enforced genuinely important rules without overstepping into tyranny. Janet Palmer was doing a good job as president, and the neighborhood had become friendlier overall, possibly because people realized how bad things could get when you let one person have too much unchecked authority. 2 years after the incident, the new trees were producing well, almost up to the capacity of the ones that had been destroyed. Rita and I were doing our spring pruning when she stopped and looked at the trees thoughtfully. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "Not just of the trees, but of how you handled everything. You stood up for what was right. You didn't back down, but you also didn't become bitter. That takes strength." "I had good examples," I said, thinking of my grandfather and father who had built this orchard with decades of patient work. That summer, the Pineville Farmers Market held its 20th anniversary celebration, and Tom Chen asked if I would be willing to speak about the importance of local agriculture. I agreed, though public speaking wasn't my favorite activity. Standing in front of a couple hundred people at the market pavilion, I talked about my grandfather starting the orchard in 1985, about my father expanding it and building relationships with local restaurants and stores, and about my own journey taking over the operation. I talked about the importance of supporting local farms and how every apple purchased at a farmer's market represented not just nutrition, but the continuation of family legacies and community connections. Then I told them about what had happened with the HOA, which most of them knew about from the news coverage, but I framed it differently. I talked about how the community had responded, how neighbors had reached out to support me, how customers had remained loyal, and how even in the face of senseless destruction, good people working together could rebuild and come back stronger. When I finished, the applause was loud and sustained. Several people came up afterward to tell me their own stories of HOA overreach or other situations where they had to stand up for their rights. It felt like I had accidentally become a symbol for something larger than just my own situation, which was strange but also gratifying. 3 years after the incident, Brenda and Martin sold their house. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they were downsizing to a condo to be able to afford the remaining settlement payments. I had a moment of guilt, wondering if I had pushed too hard, but then I remembered standing helplessly while they cut down my grandfather's trees and the guilt faded. Justice wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. The orchard continued to grow. I added a small farm stand at the property entrance, which became popular with people who didn't want to wait for the weekend farmers market. Rita finally retired at 65, though she still came bi-weekly to check on her trees, and I promoted Emma to property manager. Emma brought in new ideas, including a small U-pick section where families could come harvest their own apples in the fall, which became incredibly popular. 5 years after the incident, I was at the farmer's market when an older couple approached my booth. They looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place them until the man spoke. "You probably don't remember us," he said. "I'm Martin Cunningham. This is my sister, not Brenda, my ex-wife Brenda." "Oh," I said, genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you had divorced." "About 6 months ago. The stress of everything just broke us. But I wanted to come talk to you to apologize for my part in what happened. I knew Brenda was becoming obsessive about her HOA position, but I didn't do anything to stop her. I should have." His sister nodded. Martin told me the whole story. "What Brenda did was unconscionable. Those beautiful trees, your family legacy. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I said, not sure what else to say. "I've been buying your apples ever since," Martin continued. "Your Honeycrisps are the best I've ever tasted. I wanted you to know that I finished making the settlement payments last month. Everything's paid in full." "I appreciate that." He hesitated, then said, "Brenda's living with her mother in Idaho now. She's working retail and getting therapy. I think she finally understands what she did, but by the time she got there, it was too late for us. I just wanted you to know that there were consequences, real consequences, and maybe that matters." After they left, I thought about consequences and justice, and whether any of it really mattered in the end. My trees had been destroyed and then replaced. Brenda's life had been upended. The HOA had been reformed. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but did it actually make anything better? Then a young family approached my booth, parents with 2 small children, and the mother said, "Are you Blake from Xander Orchards? We heard you speak at the anniversary celebration 2 years ago. Your story inspired my husband and me to start our own small farm. We're growing vegetables, and we just got approved for our own farmer's market booth starting next month." We talked for 20 minutes about the challenges and rewards of farming, about dealing with regulations and building customer relationships, and the satisfaction of growing something with your own hands. As they left with a bag of apples and the kids chattering excitedly about visiting our U-pick section, I realized that maybe the point wasn't whether justice made things better in some cosmic sense. The point was that standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it cost something, created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The HOA reforms protected other residents from future overreach. My lawsuit and the publicity around it probably made other HOA presidents think twice before acting unilaterally. The story of rebuilding inspired other people to pursue their own dreams. That evening, after the market closed, I drove back to the orchard and walked among the trees. The 5 replacements were thriving now, producing almost as much as the original mature trees had. In a few more years, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart from the others. The orchard would continue, just as my grandfather had intended, just as my father had maintained, and just as I was now sustaining. I thought about Brenda occasionally, wondered if she had really changed or if she was just beaten down by consequences. I thought about forgiveness and whether I had really forgiven her or just moved past it. I decided it didn't really matter. She was no longer a part of my life and the orchard was thriving. The next morning, Janet Palmer called me. She was stepping down as HOA president after 5 years and wanted to know if I would consider joining the board. I laughed at first, thinking she was joking, but she was serious. "Blake, you understand property rights better than anyone in this neighborhood. You're reasonable, level-headed, and you don't let power go to your head. We need people like you involved." I told her I would think about it, though my first instinct was to decline. I had no desire to get involved in HOA politics after everything that had happened. But then, I thought about what Rita had said years ago about not letting what happened define the rest of my life. Maybe being involved in the HOA, helping to keep it reasonable and balanced, was another way of ensuring that what happened to me didn't happen to anyone else. Maybe it was a way of turning something negative into something positive. A week later, I attended an HOA board meeting and accepted a nomination to join as a regular board member. The neighborhood had changed a lot in the 5 years since Brenda's arrest. There were new families, people who had never known about the incident except as a story about what not to do. They knew me as the guy who ran the orchard and sold amazing apples at the farmer's market. My first board meeting was surprisingly normal. We discussed repairing some fencing around the community playground, reviewed bids for landscaping the common areas, and handled a noise complaint that was resolved with a simple conversation rather than heavy-handed enforcement. It was what an HOA should be, boring and functional, and focused on actual community needs rather than power trips. Over the next few years, I served on the board and helped guide policy in a direction that respected property rights while still maintaining legitimate community standards. We created clear guidelines for when enforcement was appropriate and when it wasn't. We instituted mandatory waiting periods before any major action. We made sure every property owner had a voice and an appeal process. The orchard continued to thrive. Emma proved to be an even better manager than Rita in some ways, bringing in modern sustainable farming practices and organic certification that opened up new markets. We expanded the U-Pick operation and added seasonal events like apple picking weekends and cider pressing demonstrations that brought in additional revenue and built community connections. 10 years after the incident, I was 45 years old and the orchard was more successful than it had ever been. The farmer's market booth was a fixture of the Pineville community, and we supplied a dozen restaurants and 6 grocery stores. The 5 replacement trees were now indistinguishable from the others in terms of production, and the section where the incident had occurred was thriving. I sometimes showed people that section and told them the story, not because I wanted to dwell on the past, but because it illustrated something important about property rights. about standing up for yourself, and about the resilience of both trees and people. Brenda never contacted me again after that one visit 10 years earlier. I heard occasional updates through the gossip network. She apparently was still in Idaho, still working retail, had remarried someone she met in therapy. I hope she had found peace and genuinely changed. I also didn't particularly care either way. She was a chapter in my life that was closed. The neighborhood had become a genuinely nice place to live, with an HOA that functioned properly and neighbors who looked out for each other without overstepping. The reforms we had put in place after Brenda's removal had created a template that other HOAs in the region actually studied and sometimes adopted. I stepped down from the HOA board after serving 6 years, feeling like I had done my part to ensure things stayed on track. Other good people stepped up to take leadership roles, people who understood that authority was a responsibility, not a privilege. The orchard remained the center of my life. I never married, never had children, and sometimes wondered if I had made the right choices. But then I would walk among the trees, see the fruit growing, know that I was continuing something my grandfather had started 70 years ago, and feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The farmers' market celebrated its 25th anniversary, and they asked me to speak again. This time I talked about perseverance, about how the best things in life take time to grow, about how setbacks are temporary but good work endures. I didn't mention Brenda or the incident directly, but everyone who had been around back then knew what I was talking about. After the speech, a teenager approached me, maybe 16 or 17, and said, "My mom told me about what happened with your trees. She said you handled it really well, that you didn't let someone else's bad actions make you into a bad person. I wanted to say that's cool. I want to be like that." That might have been the best outcome of the whole situation, that a kid I had never met learned something about standing up for yourself without losing your integrity. Maybe that was worth more than any legal judgment or settlement. That evening, standing in the orchard at sunset, I thought about everything that had happened. The destruction, the legal battles, the rebuilding, the reforms, the growth. It had been a journey I never wanted to take, but I had come through it stronger and more certain of who I was and what mattered. The apple trees rustled in the evening breeze, heavy with fruit that would soon be harvested and sold at the farmer's market, to restaurants, to grocery stores, to families who just wanted good apples. The work continued, season after season, generation after generation. And that, more than any lawsuit or settlement or arrest, was the real victory. The orchard endured. The community endured. Life continued, richer and deeper for having weathered the storm. I walked back to my house as the sun set behind the Coast Range, feeling content in a way that had nothing to do with revenge or justice, and everything to do with knowing I had stood up for what was right and built something good from the ashes of what was destroyed. The trees would keep growing. The apples would keep coming. And life, in all its complicated beauty, would keep moving forward.